It won't budge. Oh well, I guess I'll just do the video here.
When going into a game, you'd normally expect the difficulty to have a fair balance. As you progress, not only does the game get more challenging, but your skill as a player increases as well. And so the relative difficulty of the game stays rather consistent. However, not all games completely jive with this, and so unusually difficult parts can suddenly appear during a playthrough, either as the result of poor balancing, or because the game's developers couldn't comprehend how truly brutal their extra challenge actually was. This often leaves the player with either an insanely tough challenge for them to overcome, or just an insurmountable brick wall to their progress. Reaching what's known as a difficulty spike is rarely a pleasant experience, as they're highly prone to catching players off guard. For this list, I'm going to be looking into difficulty spikes from my own experience, so expect a lot of recent games on here. But don't worry, I've put timestamps in the description if you're concerned about spoilers. Also, just thought I'd clarify that just because an area is hard doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. In fact, a lot of games that I really love are featured on here. And sure, some of these parts are pretty cool in isolation, but as part of a whole game, they just sort of stick out, like some kinda spike. Kirby Star Allies is a really easy game. Well, yeah, it's Kirby. No, I mean it's easy even for a Kirby game. Star Allies has a very soft difficulty curve, even softer than Kirby himself. And that lighter difficulty is all thanks to the game's main mechanic, the Star Allies. Being able to go into a fight with 4 times the firepower even in single player is nuts! Especially with all the OP Dream Friends they've added like Marks and Magolor. Wait, Marks? Magolor? Don't tell me. The True Arena's been a series staple since Superstar Ultra, so I really shouldn't be surprised that it made it into Star Allies. If you're not familiar with it, basically, it's just a boss rush where you have access to a limited stock of healing items between each fight. It's always been the toughest part of every game it's featured in, but what makes the Ultimate Choice stand out among the other arenas is that in Star Allies, every challenge you've faced thus far has been so... not really a challenge that a boss rush where you're required to actually play semi-competently, or just spam your OP special moves, that works too, is a huge step up. When you look at all of the other Kirby games, the arenas from each one are usually pretty comparable, but the other parts of the games are not. Superstar Ultra, Return to Dreamland, Planet Robobot, these games are considerably more consistently tough, so in Star Allies, the typical spike in difficulty that the arena initiates is much more pronounced, because you're going from this to this. I can only imagine all the kids who got Star Allies breezed through the story mode, tried the Ultimate Choice, and then couldn't beat it. Even I haven't gotten past Soul Melter difficulty legitimately yet. Wait, legitimately? What do you mean? Well, there's an exploit. That's why it's so low on here. Here's what you do. First, connect a second player. The Switch comes with 2 Joy-Cons, so anyone can do this. Next, select Rocky as player 2. At the beginning of each fight or phase change, have player 2 go into rock form, thus making them invincible. Then if Kirby ever runs out of health, you have a 5-second window to revive him, making Kirby practically immortal, as well as breaking this mode in half since the whole idea is that you have a limited number of healing items. And if that wasn't enough, you can also use both controllers to do extra damage in the Void Termina fight. Even when they released Soul Melter EX, the double super chocolatey triple fudge coated ultra hardcore mode, I was able to beat it first try thanks to this. I guess sometimes the best way to avoid a spike is to just go around. Do you guys remember Culex from Super Mario RPG? Yeah, that super boss who was almost impossible to beat without the lazy shell, and whose design completely clashed with the other enemies in the game? That same guy who, in order to fight, you had to jump through a bunch of hoops first? Well, that was all well and good. Except nobody told me he was going to be in Deltarune. Like Star Allies, Deltarune is also a pretty dang easy game, except here it's more fitting because this is just the first chapter to a game that's yet to be fully released. That's why all of the enemies' attacks seem so basic when compared to what Undertale's late game enemies could do. And this is exactly what makes Jevil feel so out of place. His attacks are insane, like him, and are miles beyond what every other enemy, mini-boss, and even the chapter boss are capable of. Such antics include this annoying ring-around attack, taking you on this trippy merry-go-round, showing off his scythe collection, and he even tries pelting you to death with clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds. Wait, diamonds? You know something's wrong when one boss takes way more effort to beat than almost any other enemy in the game. Dang, looks like I'm gonna have to actually use all these healing items that I've been hoarding. I never needed them until now, but that was before the world started spinning. I haven't even mentioned how much harder this fight becomes if you attempt it pacifist, where, in order to make progress, all 3 party members have to be alive at the same time, which means your ability to progress this fight could be frequently halted whenever one of them dies or sorely needs healing. This fight really makes Deltarune Chapter 1 feel like more of a mess as we face stuff like this, followed by this, and then back to this after that. Probably should have just left him in his cage. When difficulty spikes normally occur, it's usually because an unnaturally tough challenge was placed in an inappropriate spot, but they most infamously occur when the game decides to change up the gameplay in either a radically different or subtly effective way. Funny how a small change like just changing the gravity can make such a big difference. In Super Mario Odyssey, you spend a pretty sizable chunk of the game getting a feel for Mario's movement, so when you get to the moon, you're immediately thrown off by its low gravity. But there, it's not so bad since the moon is pretty wide open and there's not much to worry about. The dark side, on the other hand, in particular Rabbit Ridge, is kinda ruthless as it throws you into this brutal boss rush where you start to notice how much of a weakness the moon's low gravity really is. Because not only does it slow your fall, making tight, precise jumps and maneuvers harder to reliably do, but it also makes you move slower in general. And because of this, the boss fight with Topper is made unusually cruel due to the low gravity. Not only is it a pretty long fight because of how many hats he has, but when he puts them all on after each hit, he does this annoying spin move where he slams all his hats on the ground and then starts spinning, which is not easy to avoid considering how slow you are during this fight. Thank goodness he's only the first boss in the gauntlet, because he's definitely the one that requires the most practice. And luckily, the rest of the Broodals fights aren't as deeply affected by the moon's gravity as much as Topper is. Except for maybe Rango, who's a bit tricky to avoid when he retreats into his hat after each hit. And, as is customary for boss rushes, there are no checkpoints. You have 3 HP plus 1 after beating Rango, and that's it. Unless, of course, you went through the effort of finding a life-up heart in another kingdom, or you bought one of those OP amiibo that can just give you one. Rabbit Ridge is unlike most other hard parts in games, since it's not harder because it's more challenging, but because you have less control, which is the main reason I included this over the darker side, which not only had a ton of skips, but also plays just like any other level in the game, so you don't need to figure out the controls again. How much worse would the darker side have been if it had the moon's gravity? We can only imagine. At some point, we are definitely going to have to talk about how optional content affects the game's difficulty curve. For example, the fight with Jevil is way harder than any other fight in the game, resulting in a big spike of difficulty. But, if you just ignore him during your playthrough, then everything seems normal. No difficulty spike in sight. However, even though it's an optional fight, it still stands out among every other fight in the game because the gap in difficulty is that wide. And at times, the optional challenges can easily halt the game's pacing to a crawl, should the player choose to attempt them. Thus, the player may end up spending less time playing the actual game, and more time just trying to beat one part. Or several. Guacamelee was a pretty simple game. You jump, you explore, you beat up skeletons, and you break other people's property. Though despite all that, the first Guacamelee was no stranger to putting in extra challenges for the hardcore gamer crowd. And Guacamelee 2 is no exception. The kind of things this game expects you to do for the optional stuff can range from manageable to really taxing on the mind and hands. There's this really precise part where you have to get through a gauntlet of platforming challenges and junk, all the while you're getting chased by insta-kill lava that sends you all the way back to the beginning. There's this part with lots of enemies that you have to kill under varying circumstances without any checkpoints or places to heal, except I lied just now because you get an overpowered upgrade pretty early in the game that allows you to heal all of your health and stamina whenever you want, which makes the gauntlet way easier, you have no idea. There's this part where you have to kill these time bomb enemies before they explode because whenever they do, it's an automatic death, thus requiring you to do a lot of crap in a row. There's this part where you kill a bird. And then finally, there's this part where you have to climb into the heavens by doing a bunch of tricky platforming. This is where the original Guacamelee would stop, but Guacamelee 2 goes even further beyond by adding an additional challenge after getting all of the key pieces. Each key piece was already nuts in their own way, but the Crucible is just the most. You've got tight corridors filled with, try again, brambles. You have wind physics to deal with, you've got insta-death projectiles, there are rooms that look like this, and what's your reward? Basically a free pass through the final level. I guess they figured that since these parts were so hard, they might as well just make the final level way easier to compensate. When a game takes this approach to difficulty, you know, just including the hardest parts as optional stuff, the completionist in me wants to do all the additional challenges to get the best ending and truly leave no stone unturned. But the purist in me realizes that going out of my way to do them may actually be getting in the way of the ideal experience. Do them or don't do them. That's the choice. Remember how I said that a game with a good difficulty balance has the difficulty increase at a similar rate to the player's skill level? Well, Just Shapes and Beats is one of those games that strikes that balance really well. After going into a level and failing, the next time you tackle it, you'll be able to have an easier time getting through it because you'll know what to expect. But that's where Cool Friends throws a monkey wrench into the equation. First, it's simple enough with a screen scroll and these basic saw blade projectiles, but then the level just sort of loses it. It starts throwing beams all over the place, projectiles are flying all over the screen, and then this turbine of saw blades appears, which makes dashing through the obstacles complicated since now when dashing through them, you could land in the pink zones and take a hit. This part can be really unpredictable because of how much stuff is going on at once. Then after that, we get to the most infamous part. The giant saw blade. This thing is what makes Cool Friends so harsh, because as it cuts across the screen, it shoots a varied spread of projectiles your way while also spraying projectiles from behind that you have no choice but to dash through. However, unlike other required dash spaces in the game, when you try dashing through the spread, you could easily get hit at the end of the dash because the squares can spread out so much that they can't be cleared in a single bound. And so you'll get hit every single time until you die too much and you're booted out of the level. When I first encountered this level during story mode, it was a huge roadblock to my progress because I couldn't get past the freaking saw. It even got so bad that I had no choice but to turn on the assist mode to give me double health, just so I could get past this one level and see the rest of the game. No other level, not even any of the bosses made me feel inclined to do that. Sure, I was able to S rank it recently, but that was only after I had Annihilate and some of hardcore mode under my belt. Also, they reduced its difficulty in a recent patch, but that's besides the point. When playing through the story for the first time, you just don't yet have the skills to beat it so easily, which is why this level trips so many people up. And of course the saw itself adds a level of perceived randomness to the level as well. Cool Friends is supposed to be the first level of the second world, but it sure doesn't feel like it. Well, I'd say it was impossible to avoid putting at least one Cuphead boss on this list. The game is pretty hard in general, but the specific difficulty of each boss is all over the place. Some bosses will be tougher and others will be a total cakewalk, all depending on what kind of player you are. Even more so when you throw power-ups into the mix. Grim Matchstick giving you trouble? Psh, just use the roundabout, dummy! Can't keep up with the ever-rising and economically complex demand for honey and other organic produce despite the derailment of bee populations? Just use the chaser! Idiot! Can't beat Dr. Call, just... Oh, wait, uh-oh. I think I jinxed it. The game's flying levels are all huge wildcards among Cuphead's cavalcade of cartoon crackerjacks, since your options are severely limited due to the different mechanics. You can equip an extra heart or two, That's it. Every other one of your power-ups is useless, which becomes especially apparent in Junkyard Jive because Dr. Call's first phase is a nightmare. There is so much stuff here that you have to pay attention to and plan for. First, there's this Hyper Beam attack that can block your fire, so if you're behind it, you can't progress the fight unless you use your specials. This garage door is constantly shooting out troops, which if left alone could swarm the whole screen and make maneuvering much more difficult. Garage door? More like garbage door. Huh? Oh god, cut that out. The chest releases this vertical beam that you have to parry to deactivate. However, apparently the good doctor threw about 17 too many wrenches into the mix because each part starts doing something new after getting destroyed. Instead of sending out a swarm of fighter bots, the garage door sends out these homing call bombs to ruin your day. The hyper beam is dropped in favor of puking nuts and bolts at you, and after destroying the chest, the robot remembers that it has hands and starts to use them. So by the time its heart is exposed, you're maneuvering around bombs, dodging bolts, accounting for whatever crap the hands are doing, meanwhile trying to land hits on the heart. Then once you take out the heart, the head starts flying around the screen. And since it's always flying towards or away from you, landing a decent hit on the thing can be a real pain. Not to mention you're being endlessly pursued by call bombs, which are somehow still coming even though it seemed like we had just rendered the robot's body inoperational after destroying the heart. Then in the final phase, Dr. Call starts spamming projectiles like he owns the place while these electric gates block your fire and try to close you in. This fight can be a bit too much at times, and since the lack of useful power-ups didn't give me much to work with during my attempts, I ended up just using the same strategy every time. Here's a couple tips. Take out the garage door first. The call bombs are much simpler to evade than the fleet. Also, if you use the kamikaze bomb special on the mouth, then the explosion will reach the chest and the antenna at the same time, taking them both out at once. Just like an actual robot, this fight has tons of moving parts to account for. It is without a doubt the most complicated fight in the whole game and can be a real pain without a strategy in mind. All this really makes Dr. Call stand out from the other World 3 bosses, who could be beaten with significantly less effort. Remember, World 3 had bosses like Werner Werman and Sally Stageplay, who could be beaten quite easily with a smoke bomb, as well as Calamaria, the other flying boss, who I beat on my first try. I guess in order to beat a mad scientist, you need to be a little mad yourself. When I first saw Nihilumbra in the eShop, I was like, whoa, shadows? Latin? Purple? I have to buy this game right now! The game was cool at first. It has this interesting mechanic where you have to draw on the terrain to add various effects in order to solve puzzles. Overall, it's a simple yet effective game that would be mostly alright, if only it didn't drag you into the darkest pit of hell upon its completion. Void Mode brings Nihilumbra's overall quality down so hard that it's not even fair. The puzzles in the story mode are pretty simple, yet effective. You walk into a room and think, let's see, what can I do here? But in Void Mode, you walk into a room and you're like, oh shit, as you're put into a situation that forces you to think on the fly, shifting this somewhat innocent puzzle game into some rather irritating trial and error territory. Does this work? Nope, crap. Void Mode is like a completely different game, the lost levels of Nihilumbra. And of course, it wouldn't be the complete annoyingly difficult package if there weren't some degree of power reduction, because several screens in this mode have these weird element flowers that prevent you from using certain abilities. It can range from something simple like not letting you use the red to kill enemies with, or it could be something even worse like removing one of the elements that grant movement options, thus making lots of seemingly straightforward puzzles nightmarishly more difficult to not only figure out, but perform as well. Living Forest 4. Oh boy. No other level in the game is more emblematic of how cruel Void Mode is than this level. The first part of this level requires you to jump over spikes, but your normal jump speed isn't fast enough to clear any of them, which means you need to use ice, the speed boosting element, except that you're using ice to jump over stationary spikes, which means that in order to pull this off, you need to have one hand on the control stick pushing right, one hand on the touchscreen drawing the ice, and one hand pressing the A button so you can jump over the spikes. But last time I checked, I only had like 2 hands. Which means if you're playing this on the Switch like I did, then you have to put the Switch down flat, then try to use the touchscreen and press the A button using the same hand, while also trying to get the timing right so you don't hit the spikes. Oh my god, this is just unnatural! And if it's not the hand pretzels that get you, then it's the split-second reactions, the oblique nebulous puzzle designs, and the dank flowers needlessly overcomplicating things. The main game was somewhat slow, but still engaging. Void Mode, on the other hand, is just a complete slog. I completed it and I got this really goofy font for my efforts, but the whole ordeal was just so tedious that when I was done, I closed the game and I never wanted to open it again. And this, my friends, is why you need to be wary of impulsively buying games. You never truly know what you're going to get, and even games that seem innocent enough can hide a dark secret that will ruin everything. You know something that I frickin' hate? When a game has you follow certain rules that the enemies are allowed to just ignore. Like, say, spikes. It's a fitting example, yeah? If you touch the spikes, you die. But what's this? The enemies can touch the spikes without any trouble. What's up with that? What makes the enemies so special? See, this is why I like Kirby. They don't pull that crap. Okay, so if I walk into you, and I take damage, then if you walk into me, shouldn't you take damage? Yes, and enemies getting special treatment is even more egregious when not only does a boss do it, but especially so when the boss has all the same powers as you, so you know they're cheating. What an evil fight! Sure, Splatoon 2's Octo Expansion DLC had some bumps in its difficulty curve like Girl Power Station and the giant statue, but this is just unfair. Part of the appeal of the Octo Expansion was that you could tackle a variety of challenges with various weapon options. In fact, Girl Power Station allowed you to pick any weapon and sub-weapon you wanted before challenging the Octoling raid. But here, they use the contrived excuse of, it's a memory, in order to force you to use the Octo Shot and the Splat Bomb, which sucks for a couple reasons. For one, it prevents me from using my preferred weapon, the Ink Brush, which I'm sure could have made this fight a whole lot more manageable if only I had the extra mobility it provides. Getting stuck with the Octo Shot vastly limits your options for how to approach this fight, and while you're stuck with the same weapon and base movement options every time, Agent 3 is over here rolling out of the way of your fire, something that you are not able to do, while constantly throwing out auto bombs, which you also don't have. But that's not all. She also throws a lot of specials into the mix, a different one for each phase of the fight, which also calls attention to the fact that you don't have any specials at all. It's a memory, dude. The Octolings didn't have specials in Splatoon 1. Yes, but if we're going off the canon of Splatoon 1, then technically Agent 3 wasn't able to roll, use the bubble blower, auto bombs weren't a thing back then, and that cape definitely wasn't there before. So is it really too much to ask to just have our full arsenal for this fight? Hey man, remember that part in Splatoon 1 where you started using a bunch of hacks to give yourself infinite ink, items that didn't exist yet, and infinite specials? Oh man, I sure do. It was the best part of the game when you really think about it. Wow, this is exactly what it was like fighting Octolings in the first game. I can't believe how accurate it is. Back to the fight itself, what really aggravates me about Inner Agent 3 isn't just how much she gets powered up, but also how much you get powered down. Beating the secret final boss with just the default Octo Shot is something I would expect someone to do as a challenge run, not something you have to do to beat the boss. And all that isn't even the half of it. This fight is 5 phases long and there aren't any checkpoints, as is par for the course. The odds are stacked up so high against you in this fight that it just comes across as unfair and aggravating. This simply isn't fun, and it was definitely the part that I was dreading returning to the most for this video. There is just so much crap that you have to put up with. Every time Agent 3 spawns, she does a splat down so you can't get close to her as easily without getting hit. She's constantly barraging you with attacks, so most of the time you're just running away to avoid dying after your armor breaks. These auto bombs are constantly harassing you. When she boards her flying saucer thing, you have to land 2 splat bombs on it in a row, which is much easier said than done. And then in the last phase, Agent 3 starts doing a bunch of splat downs in a row, which can utterly destroy you if you aren't fast enough. And given that you become slower after taking enough damage, that's highly likely. You have to go through all of this crap just for a freaking toothpick. I guess that cape was just too much to ask for. Tell me, at what point does an optional challenge become so extreme that it goes beyond simple side quest status? I touched upon how optional challenges can break the game's pacing earlier, but sometimes there's just that rare instance where you enter a new area, see how much stuff there is to do in there, and all you have to say is, oh god. Sure, We've seen boss rushes before. They can be a little tough, but ultimately, they don't normally get in the way of the rest of the game. Godhome, however, is no ordinary boss rush mode. Oh my god, where do I begin? Let's see. The boss rushes, or pantheons, each holding around 10 bosses, are very unlike other boss rushes in other games. For example, in Kirby, you get a short reprieve and, if you want, even a chance to heal after every single fight. But here, as soon as you beat one boss, you're immediately thrown into the next battle, with only enough time to heal a couple of masks in between, and you'll only get that much needed reprieve every 5 fights or so. But then Godhome goes even further with the potential difficulty by allowing you to bind certain abilities to make each pantheon harder. You can reduce the damage of your nail, decrease the amount of hits you're able to take, limit how much soul you're allowed to use for healing and spells, and most dastardly of all, go in without any charms equipped. Well gosh, if they just make the pantheons needlessly harder, why would I want to do the bindings then? Trust me, you want to do the bindings. Because after doing 8 of them, you can enable lifelike cocoons to appear in the reprieve areas, giving you extra health for the remainder of the pantheon. Plus, the more bindings you do, the greater this health benefit becomes. And you're gonna need it, pal. I'll explain what I mean by that later, but the pantheons aren't the only source of hardship to be found in this holy place. There's also the Hall of Gods, which allows you to refight individual bosses whenever you'd like. Some of them are different from how they appeared in the world, but one in particular has become rather infamous.
Charlie, we're here! In the future!
This looks exactly the same.
Shh! You'll wake the Umu.
Umu.
Oh no, listen! The Umu has awoken! Run! Hurry! Look out for the yum-yums! They're everywhere! Narslogs coming in from above! Evasive maneuvers! Charlie, look out for the blah blah blah!
Can I go home yet?
But just like the pantheons, you can increase the difficulty of each fight if you want. Ascended difficulty gives the bosses extra health and double damage, and may even spice up the boss's arena time to time, which can be cool sometimes. But other times it can be Markoth, who removes the floor, which makes this fight so annoying you have no idea. Or the Collector, who replaces the enemies it spawns with stronger versions of those enemies, including the fan-favorite Primal Aspids. And if that wasn't enough, when you beat a boss on Ascended, you unlock their Radiant difficulty. What's that? Well, it's like Ascended, except you die in one hit. Fun, right? This place is where you'll be spending most of your time, just grinding bosses, messing with different charm combinations, attempting again and again until eventually you're like, alright, I think I'll try the next Pantheon now. Wow, okay. The exclusive bosses found in Godhome can range from good to great to boring to screw you. You cannot convince me that having all of the Pure Vessel's attacks do double damage was a good idea. In general, when trying to make a boss harder, the ideal way to do it is to add new variables to the fight. Don't just increase the boss's stats. Giving Ascended bosses new arenas? Cool, now Nosk is actually a threat and provides an experience unique to its first fight. Just increasing the boss's damage and health? Not cool. Boring. It's the same fight except longer and more annoying. Speaking of longer and more annoying, after beating the 4th Pantheon, you gain access to the Pantheon of Hallownest. Before we continue, let me take you back to before Hollow Knight was released. In an old trailer for the game, Team Cherry showed off a new mechanic called Dream Diving, where you would use the Dream Nail to enter the dreams of NPCs to complete levels and fight bosses. But it was eventually scrapped because stopping to check out a new bug dream every few minutes was detrimental to the game's pacing, and it really would have distracted from exploring the world. I bring this up because Godhome is exactly what Team Cherry feared Dream Diving would become. Not only is it an area that's completely disconnected from the rest of the game, but because of the harsh difficulty curve, during your playthrough of the game, you're likely to spend 50 hours in Hallownest and 50 additional hours in Godhome. As long as you're the type of person who wants to see and do everything, like me. God, it's all just a boss rush mode when you get right down to it, but there's so much here that it's like its own game. So much so that it even has a difficulty spike of its own. The Pantheon of Hallownest is the most insane challenge in the entire game. And I mean it. It's insane. You have to slash your way through 42 intricately designed bosses who each have their own bag of tricks, not to mention that each boss is the Ascended version of the fight, complete with the different arenas and varying other changes, but not the double damage and extra health because thank god. And yes, that also means fighting Markoth without the floor. The whole ordeal is just brutal. Sure, the lifelink can make these bosses a bit more manageable, but extra health can only get you so far. Also, I neglected to mention that just like all other boss rushes, if you die, you go back to the beginning. Now this wasn't so bad in the other 4 Pantheons, which are only about 10 to 13 minutes long, but the Pantheon of Hallownest is over 40 minutes! Close to an hour of progress that could mean absolutely nothing when you reach the end and just get bodied by either Nightmare King Grimm, the Pure Vessel, or... Ugh. The Absolute Radiance. The absolute hardest boss in the game. In this fight, you have to deal with almost every attack dealing 2 masks of damage. Fast attacks, attacks that overlap on each other, projectiles that home in on you, not being able to stand on half the arena, having to hop across platforms, trying not to fall into the bottomless pit, all the while trying to stay close enough to the boss that you can even deal damage at all. So yeah, pretty easy fight. The supreme difficulty of this challenge from the outset appears almost impossible, but in many ways it seems that it was meant to be this way. In fact, Godhome, as a framing device for a boss rush, is actually pretty interesting, since the whole point is that you're trying to prove yourself as the true god of gods by taking your place at the Pantheon's peak. So if you made it through all of these challenges, if you were able to ascend the Pantheon of Hallownest, then you truly are worthy of the title, God. Before we get to number 1, I thought I'd share some honorable mentions because there's a lot more notably difficult parts in video games that I just couldn't leave out. Various bosses from Terraria's Expert Mode. What's really cool about Terraria's Expert Mode is that almost every boss is the hardest boss in the game. Being able to beat the bosses of Terraria is integral to progressing through the game, so getting stuck on any one of them can really slow the game's pacing to a crawl. But ultimately, I decided not to include them because I couldn't pinpoint one boss in particular that I felt was the most out of place. Plus, most of the bosses that could give you trouble can easily be bypassed if you just use the right strategy, like using the Daedalus Stormbow to beat the Destroyer, or using the Yo-Yo against Skeletron, or using the Daedalus Stormbow to beat Skeletron Prime, or using the Space Gun against the Brain of Cthulhu, or using the Daedalus Stormbow against the... Basically, most of the hard mode bosses can be beaten by just abusing the Daedalus Stormbow. You versus 100 robots from the Labo Robot Kit. When playing through the last level of the Robot Kit's challenge mode, I noticed that, unlike other levels, I had nearly 20 minutes to complete this challenge. For the first few parts, I wondered what that was all about until I was greeted by the final part of the level, which required me to defeat 100 other robot enemies, which is way more than what the rest of challenge mode expected of you. But in the end, it didn't make the cut because it was more long than difficult. There's not really much to it, just defeat all the robots. There's a lot of them, but they're not that hard to beat. Unlike... the Master Trainers from Pokemon Let's Go. What's weird about this one is that Pokemon Let's Go is advertised as a new, casual experience to get new players and fans of Pokemon Go into the main series. So the sudden appearance of all these trainers with really high-level Pokemon was a little off to me, because throughout the game you get kind of used to all the advantages and safety nets that you're granted, like the support trainer that lends you a hand in battles. So to just have all that stripped away when fighting the Master Trainers already makes this a huge departure from the rest of the game. In the end though, I decided to exclude them because it's just another grind, which you'll get through if you just play long enough. Sans from Undertale. And while we're on the topic of grinding and really easy games with abrupt, unreasonably difficult challenges, we have what is accurately described as a bad time. Undertale's Genocide run is a very joyless and dull experience, because during this run of the game, you're just walking around like a doofus for hours just to kill almost every enemy in one hit. Then after grinding through to the end, you get to fight Sans, who just steamrolls you. He has some of the craziest attacks in the whole game, which is made especially apparent because you weren't seeing many difficult attacks at all up until this point. Sure, there was Undyne in the middle of the run, but other than these two fights, this is probably the flattest difficulty curve in gaming history. It totally would have made the list too, except that even though I've played through this game like 6 times, I've never actually attempted a Genocide run before, so I can't accurately explain what it's like. I guess you could say that I just didn't have the heart. The ideal difficulty for the final level of a game can be a bit hard to pinpoint, as it has to strike a careful balance between challenging and fair, while still being thematically appropriate. Sure, it needs to be the ultimate challenge that tests all of the player's acquired skills, but it also needs to greatly embody the game's main themes in order to truly shine and end the game with a bang. So I have to ask, at what point does the game set the difficulty bar too high, even for a final level? And even when it is too high, what makes it so that the player will still want to keep going anyway? I ask all this because, my friends, This last challenge isn't just a spike, it's a mountain. Celeste is something of a spiritual experience. Most games of this caliber are just difficult for difficulty's sake, but Celeste uses it to help enforce its story, as the difficulty of each section in a way represents the stress and escalating tension that all culminates into this final challenge. So by the time you fall down and find yourself at the foot of the mountain once more, you don't need to be told that climbing the mountain again will be hard because you've already felt it. Every level was challenging in their own right, but none of them even compare to the summit, which is probably the most intense final level out of any game I've played recently, and it just stands out among all the other levels in the game in nearly every way. For instance, each area has a batch of strawberries for you to collect, right? Some levels have, what, 20? 30? 0? Well, the summit has 47, nearly 50 strawberries located behind fake walls, breakable blocks, additional challenges, and so on. And on top of that, there are also 6 hidden crystals that you need to find in order to collect the summit's crystal heart. This level is huge, which makes sense. I mean, it is a mountain after all. And its extreme length is certainly responsible for both the high number of deaths I've accumulated on it, as well as the hours upon hours I've spent trying to beat it, and the B-side too. Actually, one pretty cool thing about Celeste is that you can check your stats on the world map to see how many times you've died, as well as how long it took you to beat each level. So I actually took the time to log all this data into a spreadsheet and convert the numbers into 4 separate graphs showing the time, deaths, B-side time, and B-side deaths for each level. And when I combine them all together, highlight the lines, and remove the blurry overlays, you can very clearly see that everything is looking pretty normal until you notice that all 4 graphs seem to perfectly align at the summit. This is a difficulty spike. This is the literal representation of a difficulty spike. Or maybe I'm just garbage, who knows. Because the B-side for this level killed me, no joke, exactly 1,001 times. You could fill a whole TV series with just my deaths from the summit. Yet despite how long it was, despite how hard a lot of the challenges seemed, I always wanted to keep going. Even though it's such a stark contrast from the rest of the game, there's something about the summit in particular that injects you with a certain kind of determination. But why? I think it all has to do with how this particular challenge is framed. The story of Celeste is all about Madeline, who we learn is climbing the mountain in a quest for self-actualization and peace of mind after years of stressful anxiety and panic attacks. To her, conquering the mountain means conquering herself, which is why she's unable to do it until she makes peace with the part of her that she blamed for her problems. And by the way, I just thought I'd clarify that yes, while this is a game where ghosts, monsters, and physical manifestations of emotions exist, the actual gameplay is not real. Madeline isn't actually dashing, wall-jumping, feather-flying, or cloud-hopping. The platforming challenges you experience during the game are merely the hardships faced by climbing the mountain personified into gameplay, showing the player how hard the climb is for Madeline through the difficulty of the levels alone, without having to literally show her rock climbing or something. Anyway, to Madeline, in order to conquer your goals, you have to first conquer yourself, as shown by the summit being literally impossible without the second dash the repressed part of her provides. Climbing the mountain before seemed so difficult and arduous because Madeline was going into it still insecure, but after accepting the part of her at the end of Chapter 6, the task doesn't feel so daunting anymore. Like, yes, this is something that I not only can do, but will do. And without even realizing it, the player actually feels the same way. Because when the player started up the game, they also began their own journey. They went into it not knowing what to expect, experienced multiple setbacks, and was also emotionally invested in this quest to climb Mount Celeste. In fact, that's why the game is called Celeste. Because as Madeline overcomes hardship in her quest to conquer Celeste the mountain, the player triumphs through trials and tribulations in order to conquer Celeste the video game. And so the summit achieves an amazing feat where increasing the difficulty so substantially doesn't just test your skills, but your drive and your ambition as well. If you were serious about climbing the mountain, despite all of the challenges you will face, you can do this. Also, if you're wondering why I didn't include the Seasides or Golden Strawberries instead, which are arguably much harder challenges than the Summit, it's just that I couldn't be bothered to complete them after playing so much. The Summit B-side was just so incredibly taxing on me that I simply didn't have the will to do them. Sure, I was able to beat the core B-side, but I only accomplished that by playing in shifts and taking several breaks. So when I got the notification saying that I'd unlocked Seasides and Golden Strawberries, I was just like, no. No, I can't do this. I'm done. Also, I refuse to do the Golden Strawberries out of principle, because another big part of Celeste is that you're supposed to be proud of your deaths, since dying only sets you back to the last checkpoint and you respawn after a few seconds. The Golden Strawberries step all over this ideology because in order to collect them, you have to beat the entire level without dying. And yes, even the incredibly tough, incredibly long B-sides. Yeah, absolutely not. I refuse. That's stepping into some bullcrap territory where the challenge is less fair and just more of a hassle to pull off.
Wait a minute. Pull off? Oh. Wait.